Back in Vienna again. Just being in this city which has so much to offer. It's like walking through an outdoor museum with some of the most beautiful buildings in the world. The architecture is mesmerizing. But also the vibrancy, the flair, the restaurants in proximity to the vineyards and city's wine scene. That makes it an attractive destination for wine lovers from all over the world. Vienna has served as a multicultural center of this part of the world for centuries, and this is reflected in the cuisine and the wines of Austria. The city is bustling with many different languages spoken in the streets, a true testament to the diversity. And that diversity is firmly tied to the food and wine scene. This is why we're all here, to learn, to experience, to exchange, and most importantly, to enjoy the city with the best quality of life in the world and the country which it represents. Can't wait to take this opportunity to discover what colleagues from abroad and locally think about Austrian wine. Its modern wine styles that pair so well with food, the wine production balancing tradition and innovation, and how the wine culture has rejuvenated. And, of course, what the future holds for Austrian wine. Do you guys think that wine is still cool?
Oh yeah, in China, yeah, definitely. It is an indirect way of showing off, that you are different from the crowd. You drink natural wine, you are cool, right? And it's a kind of being sophisticated in a way.
I remember that my generation, which is millennials, were also in my early 20s, people were saying they're drinking less wine. So it seems like it's always the previous generation that is blaming the other for drinking less wine.
I think we're just too impatient, you know. Every generation comes to a point where it gets interested.
All generations, but especially the younger generation, they're drinking less, right? Drinking less wine. And so I think when they do choose to drink, they're being quite specific about what they're drinking. They would like to have quality over quantity. And I mean, that's a great thing, right? We all want to see that.
In Norway, where I live, Austrian wines have increased quite a lot recently, or in the recent year, basically because wines are shown in the market by people who work with marketing from Austria. And they're innovative in the way they show it.
Older generation, we are still focused on traditional, but the younger generation, we want to try like something new. So yeah, of course, we are also appreciated the Gemischtharsatz. So nowadays, the field blend becoming popular in Japan as well.
What I've seen, a really big emphasis on quality of farming, a connection with a winemaker or a place or a vibe.
Also, younger people are more and more aware of what is healthy and what is not. So in that sense, wine is not so cool anymore. But I think what Austria is doing with a lot of like biological farming, that's very important to keep wine cool for a new generation.
The new generation, which has access to information like my generation didn't really have back in the day. And there's a consciousness among these consumers looking for responsibly produced products, not just wine, but I mean, you know, they want to know that their shoes weren't made in a sweatshop in India somewhere. All right, so they have access to that information. They want to know that it was responsibly made, and they make active choices, consumer choices, based on this information.
Why do you think that Austria is at the forefront of environmentally friendly viticulture?
You know, it's always been the green heart of Central Europe.
I mean, the movement in regenerative agriculture, which I find amazingly interesting, bringing in biodiversity. Gemischtharsatz from Vienna is just one example, but we could go up and down the country and see.
Adding trees in the vineyards and all that.
Yeah, agroforestry. I mean, there's 1,001 techniques that are at the disposal of wine growers today. There's almost no excuse for bad farming.
You know, I've got no choice. My Blaufränkisch is at 14.5. I mean, there is a choice. There's always a choice. There's a choice in pruning methods. There's a choice in farming methods, ground cover. And I think there's a lot of very conscious growers in this country.
There are more and more winemakers now who are working with various types of cover crop. So when you end up having a lid across the soil, you're able to maintain soil temperature at a much cooler rate than you would if the soil was open. There are also many winemakers who are experimenting with all sorts of ferments, for example, to use as sprays in their vineyards together with the traditional sulfur and copper, which enables them to get more of a microbiologically active substance in order to naturally boost the vine's immune system.
I'm not for changing the entire makeup of the Austrian vineyard. I think the grapes that are grown here now are well suited. We know that. They're some brilliant wines.
It makes me think about Bordeaux, what's happening in Bordeaux right now. They've just started to, they just allowed hybrid varieties in the Bordeaux AOC. And I find it a bit of a pity, because you are allowing these new varieties created in laboratories, while you used to have a plethora of old varieties which were very good for that climate and for that terroir.
So Austria right now has by far and away the largest proportion of certified organic farming anywhere in Europe.
Over 20%.
27.7%. I think what's happening in Bordeaux right now is panic. It's panic because you have conventional growers harvesting Merlot at 15.5 alcohol and not knowing what to do. And so they're scrambling. And what I prefer to look at what's happening in Austria. I see biodynamic growers who have no problems harvesting at sensible levels of alcohol with good acidity.
But what about the risks you take? Because if you certify biodynamic, and then you have weather like you had just recently, and then you have lots of humidity and everything, and you can't do anything to save your vines. Whereas if you weren't certified, you could take certain measurements and maybe save some of your crop.
I think if you speak to biodynamic producers, they all tell you that they're actually suffered less than the conventional producers.
Really?
That's been my experience in the last 10 years.
When you have a 1,000 hectare estate in corporate ownership, that's when things go wrong.
I think something like 95% of wineries in Austria are family owned.
If you live right next to your vineyard, you don't want to spray chemicals on it. It's as simple as that.
That's the answer.
What new wine trends are you noticing?
I see a trend in low alcohol wines. Lately, there's a lot of demand in both retail and gastronomy for low alcohol wines.
I've seen a lot of people working with fruit or fruit and grape combinations, which I think is pretty interesting.
And it's really fun to taste a grape juice by one of your favorite winemakers and be able to compare that to their wine. It's I think grape juice has a great future.
When you taste a grape juice from a winemaker that also makes wine, do you see similarities?
Yeah, I think you can find some kind of link.
So the terroir still comes through?
Yeah, I do believe so.
What do you think, Dave?
It's a trend that will never go away. Every high-end wine list will need to have a very thoughtful non-alcoholic section. And because the competition is so poor right now that it doesn't take much to be able to be at the top of the world. One of the producers in the United States has taken the first step to actually produce a premium non-alcoholic wine. And I think that was one of the mistakes, that people assumed that it had to, people that wanted non-alcoholic wine also didn't want to spend very much money on it. In fact, that's not true at all. And so there is quite a room to be able to take the customer seriously, and they're willing to spend. That's the good news on that.
Especially in the cities, you see more and more natural wines. For me, I think it's very interesting because it adds a new flavor. So also in terms of wine pairing to foods, it gives new opportunities.
Let's talk a bit about food pairing with Austrian wine.
Our food culture is always appreciate for the more delicacy. So that's why the Austrian wine is very suit and then goes well with the gastronomic Japanese cuisine.
When we access another country's cuisine for the first time, oftentimes we're not going for everyday food. We're looking at very, very glamorous cuisine examples. And oftentimes that comes with a lot of salt, a lot of fat. We're accessing the chutoro and otoro outside of Japan for the first time, incredibly fatty cuts of tuna. And that requires the texture that Austrian wines seem to just so easily navigate.
I completely agree, and I think that texture, especially in white wines, is something that really adds an additional layer to food, and also the acidity. So with Grüne Veltliner, for example, being often quite textural and with high acid, it's the perfect pairing for some of my favorite dishes.
The reds tend to be crunchy, delicious. Even if they are aged in oak, there's always a refreshment and a salinity to them that makes them pair not just as a steakhouse wine, but across the board with a variety of dishes.
I think like every pizzeria in the world should have a glass of Zweigels to go with it. It's just amazing because there's pretty much very few pizzas in the world where there's not any sort of tomatoes involved, you know, on theirs. And Zweigel and tomatoes is just an amazing pairing.
Just so unique. Blauer Wildbacher.
Yeah.
Need I say more for people who love acid? I love acid.
Saying the wines here naturally have a lot of acid, which naturally helps them pair with a wide variety of food things.
Absolutely.
Like it's just...
Rote Veltliner.
Okay.
Love it.
Interesting.
Ooh, I think that because it has the ability to really coat the mid-palate, it lets the complex aromatics and spice in dishes that have a fair bit of spice still work with it. And when they do harbor a little bit of RS, it just coats it a little bit. It's like just having a spoonful of ice cream when you've got a lot of
Just
chili
tiny
spice.
bit of RS, right?
Yeah, just a little bit.
Austrian wines, they first got into the Netherlands through the gastronomy. So the food friendliness of the wines was like embraced immediately, especially the combination of ripeness and acidity, especially Grüne Veltliner. For me, it's like a chameleon. It's in a positive way. Like with one combination, it's more the spiciness that pops up. Another combination, it's more the freshness that pops up. Grüne Veltliner has this possibility of like showing what is needed for the dish, the same wine, and that's incredible.
It goes well with the herring.
Could be, yeah.
My first time in Amsterdam, I ended up drinking the Gruner with herring.
With herring.
In the canal. So.
Yeah, you need the acidity. Yeah.
I was talking to a winemaker the other day, and it's actually something that sometimes keeps me up at night. I'm like, why does Styrian Sauvignon Blanc not have that very herbaceous character that Sauvignon Blanc can have in other places around the world? But rather, for me, it's very, very mineral and saline and very pure, and almost has no other sort of like aromatics getting in the way of that purity and mineral concentration. And that's why I think it's one of the few wines that is the perfect partner with asparagus, because you're able to see the quality of the asparagus.
When you think of Austrian wine, do you think of tradition or innovation?
The wine world is traditional in so many senses. Marketing, growing. We've got 8,000 years of history, and what is new is old, and what is old is new again. So, I mean, I really don't have an answer to that, I'm going to be honest.
Okay.
I've got this turn to tradition because if there's one thing I really love about Austrian wine, I love this quite major movement in this country towards low intervention, very honest, very hands-off winemaking, very light touch.
You're very firm on traditions, so why don't you start? Why do you think it's all about tradition?
Well, very often when I travel to Austria, I visit producers in many different regions, and even though many of them are young and probably very innovative, I think there's also still a lot from the older generation. So that's why I think that a lot of the Austrian wine scene is at least built on traditions that people like to keep.
A lot of rational modern winemaking, I think, is innovative by nature. It's questioning, it's scientific. It doesn't have to be technical, but scientific as in they're trying to test things out and figure out why we do certain things. And
Very difficult question, huh?
We refuse to choose.
My customer's perspective is always innovation, because anytime they're introduced to an Austrian wine, the second word is always "that's different." And it just reflect their lack of familiarity, but from their perspective, always it is an innovative region to be able to discover grapes that are familiar to them. Riesling, for example. Of course, Austria is where no one's mind goes first in the United States, and that's simply, again, their ignorance, our ignorance, but it's always something that's exciting because they rediscover the same grape in a new way. And so maybe it's not the reflection of the industry's self-perception, but from our understanding, Austria is always a place to be able to push a customer to fall back in love with wine, especially when they feel that they've tasted everything.
There's a pride inherent in the country with what is produced. And I don't know, I see it at all price points with wine. So I always tell people, if you don't know what kind of wine to get on a list, you're talking to new people, pick an Austrian wine. It's not going to be bad. You're going to be, it's something new. Yeah. Give it a try.
As much as I love Austria, being Austrian, I left it in 2008, so it's a while, but I love Austrian wine for that reason, because I feel like It's very much historic inspired. There's a lot of tradition which you find there. At the same time, you can see now with the generation or the new generation coming in, maybe second, third, fourth, whatever. You see the sort of that young, eager new winemakers, the young, eager blood which is coming in, which is wanting to change and innovate. And then you have all of this is built on tradition. So I think you really can't have innovation without tradition. It's very much intertwined with each other. So I think that's for me what Austria is. It's the perfect merger between tradition and innovation. So many ways.
Yeah, well said.